The October storm of 2013 slammed into Maine's jagged coastline with unprecedented fury. Waves the height of three-story buildings crashed against the rocky shores, while hurricane-force winds howled like tortured spirits across the landscape. Penobscot Point Lighthouse, standing sentinel for over 150 years, shuddered, but remained steadfast as it had to countless tempests before. The morning after, as dawn broke across the devastated shoreline, 3 maintenance workers trudged through debris-strewn paths to assess the lighthouse's structural integrity. The massive surge had scoured away layers of earth around the foundation, exposing stonework unseen for generations. It was Donovan Pierce, a 30-year veteran of lighthouse maintenance, who first noticed the anomaly. A section of newer concrete among the ancient stone, with what appeared to be a small, sealed metal door now partially visible where the soil had been stripped away. The workers exchanged puzzled glances. This entrance appeared on no blueprint, no maintenance log, no historical record. With growing curiosity, they examined the door, finding the corroded remains of a heavy padlock, its shackle eaten through by years of saltwater exposure. With concerted effort, they pried open the rusted door, flashlights revealing a narrow tunnel stretching into darkness beneath the lighthouse foundation. 20 feet in, their beams illuminated something that stopped them cold. Propped against the tunnel wall sat a figure wearing the distinctive blue uniform of a lighthouse keeper, the fabric remarkably preserved in the cool, dry environment. But where a face should have been, empty eye sockets stared back from a yellowed skull. Nestled inside the uniform were human bones, undisturbed for what forensics would later confirm was exactly 11 years, precisely matching the mysterious disappearance of Alexander Thorne, the last keeper of Penobscot Point, who vanished without a trace in 2002. Leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a community forever changed by his absence. Before we dive deeper into this chilling discovery, I want to ask, have you ever visited a historic lighthouse? There's something both comforting and eerily solitary about these beacons that have guided ships safely home for centuries. Drop a comment below about whether you believe these isolated towers might harbor dark secrets beyond their picturesque facades. Are you watching from a coastal area with lighthouses of your own? Let me know where you're tuning in from. If mysterious disappearances and cold cases finally solved intrigue you, hit that subscribe button and join our Last Seen Stories community where we uncover the truth behind the vanished. Meredith Calloway stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug warming her palms as she watched the last vestiges of the storm churning the waters of Portland Harbor. At 48, her once fiery red hair now carried distinguished streaks of silver, pulled back in a practical ponytail that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her green eyes. 11 years in the Coast Guard's investigative service, followed by 7 more with Maine's cold case unit, had etched fine lines around those eyes, each one earned from cases that kept her awake at night, including one that had haunted her for over a decade. Her phone vibrated against the counter, and she glanced at the screen. Sheriff's Department, Lincoln County. She swiped to answer. "Calloway?" she said, her voice carrying the slight hoarseness of someone who hadn't spoken aloud yet that morning. "Meredith, it's Dale." Sheriff Dale Prescott's gravelly voice carried through the line. "Got something that's going to interest you. Maintenance crew at Penobscot Point Lighthouse found human remains this morning." Meredith set her mug down, suddenly alert. "Recent?" "That's just it. They're thinking it's Alexander Thorne." The name hit her like a physical blow. Alexander Thorne, the lighthouse keeper whose disappearance she'd investigated during her Coast Guard days. The case that had driven her to cold cases, the one she still revisited on quiet nights when sleep eluded her. How? She managed, already moving toward her bedroom to change. Sealed tunnel under the lighthouse foundation. Storm surge exposed an entrance nobody knew existed. Bodies in a keeper's uniform, and preliminary examination suggests it's been there about a decade. I'm on my way. 2 hours max. She ended the call and stood motionless for a moment. Memories flooding back of endless searches, grieving family members, and the frustration of coming up empty day after day. 30 minutes later, Meredith was driving her weathered Subaru along coastal roads still littered with storm debris. Utility crews worked to restore power to darkened communities as she passed, the aftermath of nature's fury evident in uprooted trees and scattered roof shingles. The radio droned with emergency bulletins and storm damage reports, but Meredith barely registered them, her mind racing through the details of Thorne's disappearance. Alexander Thorne, 47, was one of the last civilian lighthouse keepers before full automation. A solitary man with a passion for maritime history, he'd secured special permission to maintain residence at Penobscot Point, even as technologies rendered his position increasingly obsolete. On September 15, 2002, the Coast Guard received notice that the lighthouse's automated systems had registered a power fluctuation, but no maintenance report had been filed by Thorne. When personnel arrived to check, they found the lighthouse empty. Thorne's last log entry dated 3 days earlier, his dinner half prepared in the kitchen, and his boat still moored at the dock. Meredith had led the search operation. 14 days of combing every inch of the lighthouse, the surrounding grounds, and miles of treacherous coastline. No blood, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Local consensus eventually settled on a tragic accident, perhaps a fall from the rocks during a storm. But without a body, the case remained officially open. As she rounded the final bend in the coastal road, Penobscot Point Lighthouse came into view, its white tower brilliant against the storm-darkened sky. Even now, the sight of it triggered an uncomfortable mixture of admiration and unease in Meredith. She pulled into the gravel parking area where several official vehicles were already stationed, the sheriff's USV, a medical examiner's van, and 2 forensics units. The lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory jutting into the Atlantic, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. Meredith grabbed her credentials and notebook, then made her way along the path, noting how the storm had reshaped the familiar landscape. Where there once had been a gentle slope of earth around the lighthouse base, now jagged foundation stones were exposed, with a section of newer concrete clearly visible on the northwestern side. Sheriff Dale Prescott stood conferring with a forensics team near an open metal door in this newer section. At 56, Prescott was a solid presence, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed against weathered features. He spotted Meredith approaching and excused himself. 11 years, he said by way of greeting. Never thought we'd get answers on this one. Meredith nodded, surveying the scene. What do we know so far? Maintenance crew found the entrance about 3 hours ago, called us immediately. Emmy's preliminary assessment is that the remains match Thorne's height and build. Dental records are being checked now. A slender woman with short gray hair approached them, clipboard in hand. Meredith Calloway? She asked, extending her hand. Vivian Walsh, director of the Penobscot Point Historical Society. I've read your papers on maritime search protocols. Your work is impressive. Meredith shook her hand, noting the tension in her grip. Thank you. You maintained the historical records for the lighthouse. Everything from the original construction in 1853 to present day, which is why this discovery is so disturbing. There is absolutely no record of any tunnel system beneath the foundation. Prescott gestured toward the open doorway. Ready to take a look? Meredith nodded.
accepting the flashlight he offered. They ducked through the low entrance, the temperature dropping noticeably as they descended into the passage. The tunnel was narrow, but tall enough to stand in, professionally constructed with concrete walls and a tiled floor. Their flashlight beams revealed electrical conduits and modern ventilation. This was no historical feature, but a relatively recent addition. 20 feet in, they reached a small chamber where forensics technicians worked carefully around the remains. The skeleton sat propped against the tunnel wall, still wearing the navy blue uniform of a lighthouse keeper, the fabric remarkably preserved in the cool, dry environment. A name badge reading Thorn remained pinned to the chest pocket.
The cool, dry environment preserved a lot, the medical examiner explained, looking up from his work. Limited insect activity, no scavengers. The space was nearly hermetically sealed until today. Meredith crouched for a closer look, careful not to interfere with the evidence collection. Cause of death. The MA pointed to the skull. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head, significant enough to be fatal. There's also a fracture to the right ulna, defensive wound, most likely. Murder, then, Meredith said, the confirmation of what she had long suspected settling heavily in her stomach. Undoubtedly, the ME confirmed, and look at this. He carefully lifted the skeletal right hand. Clutched between the phalanges was a yellowed scrap of paper, preserved by the dry conditions. We haven't removed it yet, waiting for proper documentation. Meredith leaned closer, shining her light on the paper. Even without touching it, she could see it was a torn page from a Lighthouse log, the distinctive format and partial date, September 12, 2002, clearly visible. 3 days before Thorn was reported missing. "We need to know what's on that page," she said, straightening up. "And we need to understand who had access to this place in 2002. Someone built this tunnel for a reason, and that reason got Alexander Thorn killed." September 15th, 2002. The morning broke clear and bright over Penobscot Point, the type of crisp autumn day that made the Maine coastline a photographer's dream. Coast Guard officer Meredith Calloway stepped from the patrol boat onto the small dock, nodding to her team to secure the vessel while she approached the lighthouse keeper's quarters. "Mr. Thorn," she called, knocking firmly on the weathered door. No response. She tried again, louder. "Coast Guard, we're here about the power fluctuation." After a third unanswered knock, procedure dictated they enter. The door was unlocked, not unusual for remote lighthouse locations. Inside, the scene was unremarkable, yet unsettling in its normalcy. A half-chopped onion sat on the cutting board. In the kitchen, a pot of water on the stove, never heated. A book lay open on the sitting room table, greeting glasses placed carefully on top. Everything suggested Thorn had stepped away momentarily, intending to return. "Check the tower," Calloway instructed 2 team members. "I'll search the quarters." The living areas revealed nothing unusual. Thorn's bedroom was neat, bed made with military precision. His credentials and wallet sat on the dresser. In his small office, the logbook lay open to September 12, 3 days prior. The final entry, written in Thorn's methodical hand, noted routine maintenance and clear visibility conditions, nothing to suggest distress or concerns. "Tower's clear," reported Ensign Rodriguez, returning from the spiral staircase. "Beacons functioning normally. Automated systems kicked in as designed. No sign of Thorn." "His boat's still docked," called another officer from outside. "Doesn't look like it's been used recently." Meredith stepped onto the rocky ground surrounding the lighthouse, scanning the treacherous shoreline. Fall storms had been battering the coast, and the rocks were slick with sea spray. A misstep could easily send someone into the churning waters below. "Get search parties organized," she ordered. "Underwater team, shoreline sweep, and contact local fishing vessels to watch for anything unusual. And get me everything we have on Alexander Thorne." The search began immediately and expanded rapidly. Coast Guard vessels patrolled a 10-mile radius. Helicopters scanned the coastline. Local volunteers combed nearby beaches and coves. Days stretched into weeks without a single clue to Thorne's whereabouts. His background provided few insights. Alexander Thorne, 47, unmarried, had served 20 years in the Navy before taking the lighthouse keeper position 7 years earlier. No criminal record, no financial troubles, no known enemies. His sister in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, reported no unusual communications. His few friends described him as dedicated, meticulous, and intensely private. "I loved that lighthouse," said Calvin Murphy, a local fisherman who delivered supplies to Penobscot Point twice monthly. Said he felt more at home there than anywhere else on Earth. No way he'd abandon his post voluntarily. The last confirmed sighting came from Abigail Norton, who ran the general store in the nearby village of Bristol Cove. "He came in for supplies on September 12th, same as always. Seemed preoccupied, though. Asked me if I noticed any unusual vehicles around town. When I asked why, he just shook his head and said it was probably nothing." Most telling was the testimony of Dr. Theodore Lawson, who had encountered Thorne at the local library the same day. "He was researching something intensely, property records, I think. When I greeted him, he closed the books quickly, seemed almost nervous. Said something odd as he left. Some things should stay buried, but the truth isn't one of them. Stuck with me how serious he looked." As September turned to October, the search scaled back. Without evidence of foul play, the official theory settled on accidental drowning, the body likely carried out to sea by strong currents. The case remained open but inactive. For Meredith Calloway, it became the first significant failure of her investigative career. The case that taught her, sometimes there are no answers, only questions that fade with time. But Thorne's last logbook entries, reviewed countless times during the investigation, contained subtle irregularities that continued to trouble her. In the week before his disappearance, his normally precise notations became cryptic, with references to unusual maintenance requirements and structural concerns requiring further documentation. The final entry on September 12 included a perplexing note: "Verification of foundation integrity urgently needed. Historical discrepancies must be resolved." No one could explain what discrepancies Thorne had been referring to, and without further evidence, the investigation gradually ceased. Alexander Thorne joined the long list of those who'd gone to sea and never returned, a fate familiar to coastal communities since immemorial. The lighthouse was fully automated the following year. Thorne's position never refilled, his disappearance becoming local legend rather than active investigation. Until today, 11 years later, when the storm had scoured away the earth and revealed what someone had tried very hard to keep hidden. In the makeshift command center established in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, Meredith spread out the evidence collected so far. The remains had been carefully removed for full forensic examination, but photographs covered one wall showing the skeleton's position and the surrounding tunnel area in detail. "Dental records confirm it's Alexander Thorne," Sheriff Prescott announced, entering with a folder of reports. The MA puts time of death between September 12 and 14, 2002, consistent with our timeline of his disappearance. Meredith nodded, studying the photos. "And the log page he was holding?" "Still being processed, but preliminary analysis shows it's from September 13, a date missing from the official logbook we found during the original search. So he made an entry after what we thought was his final record on the 12th. Then someone tore it out. but he managed to keep a piece of it. Exactly, and there's more. The uniform he was wearing isn't his daily uniform. It's his formal dress uniform, the kind kept for special occasions or inspections. Meredith frowned. Why would he change into his formal uniform to inspect the tunnel? He wouldn't, said Vivian Walsh, entering with an armful of historical documents, unless he was meeting someone officially. Walsh spread blueprints and historical photographs across the table. I've brought everything we have on the lighthouse's construction and modifications. There is absolutely nothing about a tunnel system in any official record. What about unofficial records? Meredith asked. Walsh hesitated. That's complicated. The lighthouse underwent a major restoration in 2001-2002, just before Thorne vanished. Who oversaw the restoration? Lucas Bennett was the administrator for the fund. He hired the contractors and managed the project. Meredith made a note. We need to speak with him. Walsh's expression tightened. That might be difficult. Lucas left the area shortly after the restoration was completed. Some kind of family emergency in Arizona, he said. Never returned. Convenient timing, Meredith observed. What about the forensics on the remains? Anything else significant? Prescott consulted his notes. Defensive wounds on the right arm, as we saw. Fatal blow to the back of the head, likely from a heavy, blunt object. And something interesting. The ME found traces of a fabric fiber embedded in the skull fracture, consistent with the covering of a hammer or similar tool. A construction tool, Meredith said, the pieces beginning to connect. From the restoration project. There's one more thing, Prescott added. During the examination of the uniform, they found this. He placed an evidence bag on the table containing a small brass key, tarnished with age. It was sewn into the lining of the jacket pocket. Meredith examined the key through the plastic. Not a door key. Looks like it might be for a lockbox or filing cabinet. Whatever it opens, Thorne thought it was important enough to hide. Prescott observed. We need to interview everyone connected to that restoration project, Meredith said, starting with the contractors who would have the expertise to build that tunnel. Over the next 2 days, they tracked down and interviewed 3 former maintenance staff members and 2 assistant keepers who would occasionally relieve Thorne. None had knowledge of any tunnel, though one maintenance worker, Roy Donovan, recalled Thorne becoming increasingly concerned about the restoration work in the months before his disappearance. He kept saying things weren't being done to specification, Donovan remembered. Said he reviewed the original blueprints himself and something wasn't right about the foundation work. The construction crew would only come when he was scheduled to be off-site, which he thought was mighty strange. Most revealing was their interview with Patricia Hammond, the Coast Guard administrator who had supervised Thorne. Alexander contacted me about a week before he disappeared, said he had documentation of serious irregularities with the restoration project that required immediate attention. I scheduled a meeting for September 16th, but he never showed. Did he indicate what kind of irregularities? Meredith pressed. He wouldn't say over the phone, just that it involved structural modifications, unauthorized by any historical preservation standard. I assumed he was being his usual perfectionist self without historical accuracy. As they left Hammond's office, Meredith turned to Prescott. The tunnel doesn't appear on any blueprint because it wasn't part of the official restoration. It was built secretly for a purpose we still don't understand. And Thorne discovered it, got himself killed for it. We need to see his personal effects, Meredith said. There must be more he documented that wasn't in the official logbook. At the Penobscot Point Historical Society headquarters in Bristol Cove, Vivian Walsh reluctantly led them to a climate-controlled storage room. We maintain an archive of all lighthouse keepers' personal effects when possible, she explained, retrieving a sealed box labeled A. Thorne, 2002. Alexander's sister donated his belongings after the Coast Guard declared the case inactive. The box contained journals, photographs, and personal correspondence, the ordinary artifacts of a solitary life. Meredith carefully examined each item, looking for anything that might explain what Thorne had discovered. Tucked between the pages of a personal journal, she found several sheets covered in what appeared to be a simple substitution cipher. "He encrypted his notes," she said, showing Prescott. "Smart move if he was documenting something sensitive." "Can you break it?" Prescott asked. "Given time, it looks like a basic cipher he created himself, not military grade." As they continued through the materials, Meredith noticed Walsh growing increasingly anxious, checking her watch repeatedly and steering them away from certain areas of the archive. "Ms. Walsh, you seem uncomfortable with our investigation. Is there something you're not telling us?" Walsh's composure cracked slightly. "It's just disturbing to think Alexander might have been murdered. He was dedicated to preserving the lighthouse's history." "You knew him well?" Prescott asked. "Professionally," Walsh said quickly. "The Historical Society worked closely with him during the restoration." "And with Lucas Bennett?" Meredith asked, watching Walsh's reaction carefully. A flash of something, fear perhaps, crossed Walsh's face before she composed herself. "Mr. Bennett was the administrator, yes. I was just the assistant director then." "When exactly did Bennett leave the area?" Meredith pressed. "I don't recall precisely. Late September 2002, I believe." "Right after Thorne disappeared," Meredith noted. "Interesting coincidence." "The restoration records," Prescott interjected. "We'd like to see those as well." Walsh hesitated. "Those would be in administrative storage. I'd need to retrieve them. Perhaps tomorrow would be better." "Now would be better," Meredith said firmly. "This is a murder investigation, Ms. Walsh." Reluctantly, Walsh led them to another storage room, this one less meticulously organized. As she searched for the relevant files, Meredith wandered the stacks, noting the labels on various boxes. One caught her eye: PPHS Personnel Records 2000 to 2005. While Walsh was distracted, Meredith quickly opened the box and flipped through the folders, stopping at one labeled Bennett L. Inside was a personnel file with a photograph of Lucas Bennett, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. More interesting was a handwritten note paper-clipped to the file. "Relocated to Boston area. Contact only through Stewart and Associates." Meredith snapped a quick photo with her phone before replacing the file as Walsh approached with the restoration records. "Here they are," Walsh said, placing a thick binder on the table. "All the official documentation of the restoration project." As they reviewed the materials, Meredith noticed a significant discrepancy between the budgeted expenses and the actual expenditures. "Nearly $300,000 unaccounted for," she murmured to Prescott. "That's a substantial overage for a project this size." "Cost overruns happen in construction," Walsh said defensively. "Not without documentation," Meredith countered. "There's no explanation here for where that money went." They left with copies of the restoration records, Walsh's obvious relief at their departure only heightening Meredith's suspicions. Back at the command center, Meredith spent hours working on Thorne's cipher while Prescott made calls to track down the construction company that had performed the restoration work. By midnight, Meredith had deciphered enough of Thorne's notes to confirm their suspicions. He discovered the tunnel during an inspection of the foundation in early September, she told Prescott. Realized it had been built during the restoration but wasn't in any of the plans. He started investigating the financial records and found evidence of embezzlement, hundreds of thousands of dollars diverted through fraudulent invoices. She paused, looking at a particularly intriguing passage she just decoded. "There's something else here. Thorne mentions hiding evidence where only the faithful guardian can see it, and references the sentinel stone that watches from the summit. He must have hidden something at the top of the lighthouse tower."
That matches what we're seeing in these records, Prescott agreed. And I reached the former project foreman, Michael Sanderson. He's agreed to meet us tomorrow morning, said he's not surprised we're finally asking questions. The next morning, they met Sanderson at a diner in Portland. Now in his 60s, the former construction foreman was clearly uncomfortable, but determined to unburden himself. I knew something wasn't right about that job, he said, voice low, despite the privacy of their corner booth. Bennett had us build that tunnel off the books. No permits, no inspections, paid us cash bonuses to keep quiet about it. Said it was for historical authenticity that wouldn't pass modern building codes. Did you question it? Meredith asked. Sanderson looked ashamed. Not enough. The money was good, and Bennett had all the right paperwork showing he had authorization. It wasn't until later I realized those documents were probably forged. When did you last see Bennett? Prescott asked. Mid-September 2002. He paid the final bonuses, said the project was complete, and that we were never to discuss the tunnel with anyone, including the lighthouse keeper. But Thorne discovered it anyway, Meredith said grimly. I heard he disappeared right after. Always wondered if there was a connection. Never had the guts to come forward. Better late than never, Prescott said. We'll need a formal statement.
After taking Sanderson's detailed testimony, they returned to the county records office to dig deeper into the financial aspects of the restoration. What they uncovered was a sophisticated embezzlement scheme. Bennett had created multiple shell companies that submitted invoices for work never performed, with payments routed to offshore accounts. He stole over $400,000, Meredith concluded, reviewing the evidence. The tunnel was never about historical preservation. It was a way to inflate costs and justify the fraudulent expenditures. But why keep Thorne's body there? Prescott wondered. Why not dispose of it in the ocean, where it might never be found? Maybe he didn't have time, Meredith suggested, or maybe there's more to the tunnel than we've discovered. A call from the forensics team interrupted their speculation. We've processed the page fragment found in Thorne's hand, the technician reported. It's partially legible. The entry reads, September 13th, 2002. Meeting with LB to discuss unauthorized tunnel, bringing documentation of financial discrepancies. God help me, but I believe this restoration project has been nothing but a front for... That's where it tears off. LB, Prescott said after the call ended. Lucas Bennett. Thorne confronted him with evidence of the embezzlement and paid with his life. Back at the lighthouse, they conducted a more thorough examination of the tunnel system. The second chamber, previously thought empty, revealed something when examined under alternative light sources. Faint residue on the floor in a rectangular pattern. Something was stored here, the forensics technician explained. Something approximately 6 feet by 3 feet, heavy enough to leave compression marks on the concrete. Large enough for crates, Meredith observed. The tunnel wasn't just about embezzlement. Bennett was using it for storage. Storage of what? Prescott wondered. Meredith looked up at the lighthouse tower. Let's check the top of the tower. Thorne's coded notes mentioned hiding evidence at the summit near a sentinel stone. In the lantern room at the top of the lighthouse, Meredith examined the stone walls carefully. The faithful guardian in Thorne's notes likely referred to the lighthouse itself, the guardian of ships at sea. Near the eastern window, she noticed a stone that protruded slightly more than the others. When pressed, it moved inward, revealing a small cavity behind it. The sentinel stone, she murmured, reaching inside. Her fingers found a small waterproof container holding a micro SD card. Back at the command center, they accessed the contents, dozens of photographs and a video file. These are from a surveillance camera. Thorne must have installed it secretly after becoming suspicious of the restoration work. The photos show Lucas Bennett and 2 unidentified men moving crates through the tunnel at night. The video, dated September 10, 2002, captured a heated argument between Bennett and one of the men, although the audio was too poor to discern exact words.
"We need to identify these individuals," Prescott said, sending the images to the FBI's facial recognition unit. While waiting for results, Meredith returned to the Historical Society to confront Vivian Walsh with what they discovered. She found Walsh in her office, frantically shredding documents. "Going somewhere?" Meredith asked from the doorway, noting the packed suitcase beside Walsh's desk. Walsh froze, her face draining of color. "I was just organizing old files." "By destroying them?" Meredith stepped into the office. "We know about the embezzlement scheme, Ms. Walsh. We know Bennett built the tunnel to inflate costs and justify fraudulent expenditures. What we don't know is what else he was using that tunnel for, or how deeply you were involved." Walsh slumped into her chair, the fight going out of her. "I didn't know about Alexander," she said quietly. "I swear I didn't know Bennett killed him." "But you knew about the financial fraud," Meredith pressed. Walsh nodded reluctantly. "I was Bennett's assistant. I processed the paperwork, asked no questions. The restoration project was vital for the community. Without it, the lighthouse might have been decommissioned entirely. I told myself the financial irregularities were necessary compromises." "What happened on September 13th, 2002? Meredith asked directly. Walsh's hands trembled as she spoke. "Alexander called me that morning. Said he'd discovered serious financial discrepancies and an unauthorized structural modification. Demanded a meeting with Bennett. I called Lucas immediately." "You warned him," Meredith said flatly. "I thought he'd just explain things to Alexander, smooth it over somehow. That afternoon, I was working late at the office when Bennett arrived, agitated, clothes disheveled. He said there had been an accident, that Alexander had fallen and hit his head during an inspection of the foundation. I didn't believe him, but I was too afraid to question further." "And you've kept this secret for 11 years, Meredith said, disgust evident in her voice, while Alexander's family wondered what happened to him. "Bennett threatened me," Walsh whispered. "Said I was complicit in the financial fraud, that I'd go to prison too, if it ever came to light. After he left town, I convinced myself it was better to stay quiet, that nothing could bring Alexander back anyway." "What was Bennett storing in that tunnel, Ms. Walsh?" Meredith asked. She shook her head. "I don't know the details. Some kind of smuggling operation, I think. Antiquities, maybe, or artwork. Bennett had connections with private collectors. The tunnel provided access to the sea through a hidden opening below the tide line. A way to move items in and out without customs inspection. We need every detail you can remember, and you're going to provide a full statement to Sheriff Prescott."
As Walsh was being taken to the sheriff's office, Meredith received a call from the forensics team at the Lighthouse. "Agent Calloway, we found something else. A second hidden door in the main tunnel, disguised as part of the wall. It leads to a small chamber containing communication equipment, a sophisticated radio setup, weatherproofed and still operational." "On my way," Meredith said, already moving toward her car. At the Lighthouse, the forensic technician showed her the hidden equipment, a high-frequency radio system with encryption capabilities connected to a power source that tapped into the lighthouse's electrical system. "It's been transmitting a regular ping signal every 24 hours, like a check-in. And here's the strange part. It received a response signal yesterday after we discovered the tunnel. Someone knows we found it," Meredith realized. Someone still connected to whatever operation Bennett was running. She hurried back to the command center, where Prescott was reviewing the results from the FBI's facial recognition search. Got a hit on one of Bennett's associates, Thomas Hargrove, known smuggler with connections to black market art dealers. The other man is still unidentified. "And Bennett himself?" Meredith asked. "No current records under that name, but we just got an interesting tip from Boston PD. They've been watching a man named Lawrence Blackwood for suspected connections to art theft. Their surveillance photos." He slid a folder across the desk. "Compare them to Bennett's personnel file." Meredith examined the photos. Despite the passage of 11 years and some apparent cosmetic surgery, the resemblance was unmistakable. "It's him. Bennett's been living in Boston under an alias." As they coordinated with Boston PD to set up surveillance on Blackwood's residence, an officer rushed in. "Sheriff, we just got word from the security team at the Lighthouse. Someone breached the perimeter and tried to access the tunnel."
"Did they apprehend them?" Prescott asked, already reaching for his jacket. "Yes, sir. They're bringing him in now." 20 minutes later, a man in his late 60s was led into the sheriff's station in handcuffs. Though he clearly tried to disguise his appearance with a beard and glasses, his eyes, that distinctive piercing blue, matched the personnel photo of Lucas Bennett. In the interrogation room, the man sat with remarkable composure despite his circumstances. Meredith studied him carefully before entering. According to the arresting officers, he'd been caught trying to access the tunnel system with specialized tools and a small explosive device. "Mr. Bennett," Meredith said, as she sat across from him, "or do you prefer Lawrence Blackwood these days?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he controlled it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Boston's not that far from Maine. Convenient for keeping an eye on your old projects. When the radio system in your tunnel picked up activity, you couldn't resist coming to check, could you?" Bennett's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent. "We've found everything," she continued. "The embezzlement records, the surveillance footage Alexander Thorne recorded, the communications equipment still sending signals to your associates, the tunnel to the sea for moving smuggled goods." She opened a folder, removing the photograph of Bennett from his personnel file. "You've had some work done, but those eyes are unmistakable. Was maintaining the operation worth coming back to the scene of your crime?" The man finally spoke, his voice cultured despite the tension behind it. "I want a lawyer." "Of course," Meredith agreed, "but before we go down that road, you should know that we've already arrested Vivian Walsh. She's been quite cooperative about the financial fraud, and we've identified Thomas Hargroves from the surveillance footage. It's only a matter of time before the entire operation is exposed." Bennett, for it was indeed him, maintained his composure, but Meredith could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. "Whatever Miss Welsh told you is hearsay," he said finally, "and any alleged financial irregularities from a decade-old restoration project would be well beyond the statute of limitations." "True," Meredith acknowledged, "but murder has no statute of limitations, Mr. Bennett, and Alexander Thorne's body, preserved in that tunnel you built, provides compelling physical evidence." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Bennett's face. "Thorne's death was an accident. He confronted me about the restoration discrepancies, became agitated, slipped and fell against a tool chest. I panicked." "So you dressed him in his formal uniform and sealed him in a hidden tunnel?" Meredith asked, skeptically. "The uniform was his idea. He dressed formally for what he called an official confrontation. After the accident, I couldn't risk discovery. The tunnel was secure, unknown to anyone else. It seemed the safest solution." "And the smuggling operation? Was that just a side benefit to the embezzlement scheme?" Bennett's expression hardened. "I've said all I'm going to say without counsel present." Meredith decided to try a standard interrogation tactic. "And what about your partner?" she asked casually. "We have the surveillance photos that show 3 of you in the tunnel. You, Hargrove, and a third man." She watched Bennett's reaction closely. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained silent. "Hargrove's already talking," Meredith continued, allowing the bluff to build. "Says you were paranoid after Thorne's death, thought your other partner might talk." A muscle in Bennett's jaw twitched, but he still said nothing. "Was there a falling out?" Meredith pressed. "Did you handle the third partner the same way you handled Thorne?" Bennett's composure finally cracked. "That would be Hargrove's doing, not mine," he snapped. "After Thorne's death, Thomas became paranoid, thought our other partner might talk. I didn't ask questions when Daniel disappeared. Didn't want to know." Meredith kept her expression neutral, though inwardly she was surprised by the success of her bluff. There had been no mention of a missing third person in any of their evidence so far. "Daniel Weiss," Bennett continued, seemingly resigned now that he'd started talking. "He was our contact with the buyers. After Thorne, he got nervous, wanted out. Hargrove said he'd handle it. I didn't ask how." "Where?" Meredith asked simply. Bennett shrugged. "Never said specifically. Somewhere remote, I assumed. Maybe even at sea."
Over the next 24 hours, as evidence continued to mount and Hargrove was located and arrested in Boston, Bennett's resolve crumbled further. Facing multiple charges of financial fraud, smuggling, and murder, he offered a full confession in exchange for considerations at sentencing. The truth, when finally revealed, was both simpler and more complex than they had imagined. The embezzlement from the Restoration Fund had indeed been the initial crime, with Bennett siphoning money through fraudulent contractors.
The tunnel had been built both to justify the inflated costs and to facilitate a secondary operation, smuggling valuable historical artifacts out of the country to private collectors. The lighthouse's remote location made it perfect, Bennett explained during his formal statement. Small boats could approach at night, transfer items through the sea entrance of the tunnel, and no one would ever know. We moved millions in artifacts over just a few months. And Thorne discovered this, Meredith prompted. Bennett nodded. He was too observant, too dedicated to that lighthouse. Noticed discrepancies in the blueprints, started asking questions. When I confronted him with evidence of the financial fraud, I tried to buy him off. He refused, said he was going to the Coast Guard with everything he'd found. So you killed him, Prescott said flatly. It wasn't premeditated, Bennett insisted. He threatened exposure, we argued, I pushed him. He fell against a toolbox, hit his head. When I realized he was dead, I panicked and hid his body in the tunnel. How exactly did you secure the door? Meredith asked, pressing for details. Bennett shifted uncomfortably. I used the highest-grade marine padlock money could buy. It was designed to withstand saltwater corrosion for decades. I secured it myself, then buried the door under tons of soil. I thought it was sealed forever. His expression darkened with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I never imagined that storm would expose it, or that even the best lock would fail after years of burial. I underestimated the power of the sea and time. Bennett's confession also led them to information about the third partner, Daniel Weiss, but contrary to what Meredith had implied during her interrogation bluff, no body was found. According to both Bennett and later Hargrove, who cut his own deal with prosecutors, Weiss had indeed disappeared in late 2002, shortly after Thorne's death. Hargrove claimed he put Weiss on a boat to Europe with a new identity, Prescott told Meredith as they reviewed the case files, but there's no way to verify that. For all we know, Weiss could be at the bottom of the Atlantic. Another case for another day, Meredith said. At least we solved the one that mattered most to me. With Bennett's information, authorities recovered millions in stolen artifacts and dismantled an international smuggling network that had operated for over a decade. On a clear November morning, 2 months after the storm had exposed the hidden tunnel, a small gathering assembled at Penobscot Point Lighthouse for a memorial service. Coast Guard personnel in dress uniforms stood at attention as Alexander Thorne's remains, now properly recovered and examined, were committed for burial with full honors in the small cemetery overlooking the bay. Meredith stood slightly apart from the main group, watching as Thorne's sister placed a wreath at the base of the lighthouse. Bennett and his accomplices were awaiting trial, the evidence against them overwhelming. The Penobscot Historical Society, under new leadership, had established a scholarship in Thorne's name for students of maritime history. As the ceremony concluded, Meredith climbed the spiral staircase to the top of the lighthouse tower. The autumn air was crisp and clear, providing visibility for miles across the Atlantic. She thought about Alexander Thorne, the dedicated keeper who had given his life protecting not just ships from dangerous shores, but the integrity of the beacon he had sworn to maintain. Sheriff Prescott joined her on the observation deck. Coast Guards decided to keep a permanent caretaker here. Automated systems will still handle the primary functions, but they want a human presence to honor the tradition and to make sure nothing like this happens again. Meredith nodded, gazing out at the horizon where sea met sky in an endless blue line. Thorne would have approved of that. You solved this case, Prescott observed. After 11 years, brought him home. The storm did that, Meredith corrected. Nature has a way of revealing what man tries to hide. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the lighthouse's automated system activated, sending its powerful beam out across the darkening waters, a constant, unwavering guide through uncertain territory, just as Alexander Thorne had been in life. Steadfast in his duties, unwilling to be swayed from what he knew was right. Meredith placed her hand briefly on the weathered stone wall of the tower. "Rest easy, keeper," she murmured. "Your light still shines."